Hello and welcome to The Stories That Brought You Here. It's the podcast dedicated to the stories of the people living in and around the Salish Sea. I'm your host, Chris Wakaluk, and on this program, I sit down in one-on-one conversations with people to find out the stories that brought them to this magical part of the world we all live in, and to also hear the stories that brought them to the point that they're at in their lives right now. This time around, I'll be speaking to Robert Dill. And before I go any further, I just want to preface this with, I was deeply inspired while sitting down with Robert and listening to the stories and accomplishments in his life. And I hope you will be as well too. The conversation began with him talking about the purchase of a summer home on South Pender Island 49 years ago. And it weaved its way through him discussing his involvement working in the James Bay area for community development purposes. He talks about drinking Kava in the Vanuatu Islands, sacred dance journeys, magical happenings in Scotland, and it ends with him talking about his involvement with the Pender Island Health Centre and how he helped transform that place many years ago. All that and more in a very delightful interview, and before we get to that, I'm just going to mention a few things, and the first off is I'm going to be doing more podcasts coming up in the very near future here. I've recorded a number of them with people in the last couple of weeks, and the main reason for that is that I'm totally reinvigorated and inspired to get back on the podcast horse again. It's been a little while, and through COVID, I've only done a handful of these and some shorter ones, but getting to talk to people again and doing full-length interviews has been great. If you would like to keep up to date with new podcast releases, there's many ways to do so. I have a YouTube page now you can watch on there. That's called The Stories That Brought You Here on YouTube. There's also the Facebook group page, and if you're on such a thing as Twitter, I'm there as well too. All the links you can find in the show description. And I'd also like to mention that this episode is sponsored by the Tree and Transformation Calendar, made by my lovely wife, Geneva. For the past number of years, she's been creating beautiful calendars featuring original works of art. And for 2023, she's created a colorful, beautiful calendar with each month representing a different tree. The calendars come on individual pieces of paper, so you can hang 1 month at a time, or 12 on a wall, as some people have, or 3 on your refrigerator like we do at home. As I've mentioned, she's been making these calendars for years now, and people love them. So a purchase of these calendars is not just going to help you know what day it is every day next year, it's also going to help contribute to keeping this podcast rolling along. I put a lot of time into making these interviews sounding great, and I love doing them, but they do take quite a lot of time. I've been trying to figure out a way to help offset the costs of making this podcast, and I came up with this idea to help support my wife sell calendars, which in turn helps me and helps this podcast. So if you like what I do here and you want to help support this, you can buy a calendar or you can buy more than one. Please go to genevajacobsart.com, and there you can find the calendars for sale. You'll find a link for that as well in the show notes. Just click on that and it should send you to the page where you can purchase the calendars, which again are totally beautiful, and you can see the images of the calendars there. So thank you for listening to that. Now it's time for a little bit of music and then my interview with Robert Dill. How's your day been so far? What'd you get up to on this early morning we're at?
I got up, noticed last night I had a leak in a skylight right in the glass itself. It's coming into the kitchen very slowly, but so I went and put a piece of plastic over the whole skylight and roped it so that it wouldn't leak, and had a quick breakfast and drove here.
Wow, really? All this before 10 in the morning?
Yeah.
Okay, geez. All right. Wow, that's unfortunate to have a leak in the skylight.
Well, the house is getting old, so I kind of expect those things every once in a while. But I've spent the last month, when it's been nice and dry, kind of preparing the whole place for the winter. So that was kind of an unexpected little glitch.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Well, we're here in the early part of November on a rainy Friday morning, and the rains have actually been coming down pretty hard the last couple of weeks after that long summer we had. Yeah. Hopefully that gets all cleared up and everything in this this old house that you're referring to that I think we're going to be delving into. But I will also start off by saying welcome to the podcast and thanks for being here, Robert.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So let's start with the first traditional question here of what brought you to Pender Island?
Chance. I was working as an architect in Vancouver. I had just completed a job in Cape Breton, pretty major job, and had come back. I'd saved up about $7,000, and a good friend in the theater department invited me to go sailing for a week, and we sailed throughout the Gulf Islands. And in that process, I fell in love with them. And then I had another week before I had to go back and teach in the Arts 1 program at the university. So a friend lived on Salt Spring, and his uncle, Gavin Reynolds, had 20 acres for sale. So he said, why don't you come over and take a look at it? You might be interested. And we couldn't afford the place we lived in Vancouver. It was right on Marine Drive and had a quarter acre of trees in amongst all the mansions of Vancouver. And the landlord would put the price up a little bit each year. I mean, when I think back on it, it was like $70,000 or something like that. But I thought, well, that's just a bit more than I've got right now. So we thought, well, we're looking over on Salt Spring, and came over. Gary, who invited us over, was a contractor, and so he worked building all day. And then he came home at night and tried to build and work on his place. And he was pretty exhausted, and we looked around a bit. Didn't like the 20 acres that was up for sale. And he said, if you have a chance, try to buy a place that has a house on it so you're not exhausted like myself. So we looked around Salt Spring, couldn't find anything, and had a couple days left. And he said, go over to the Penders. They're kind of nice. And drove down, stopped off at Bedwell Harbor at the resort. And there was a little store there, and there was a young woman in the store. And I just happened to ask her if she knew any places for sale. And she said, oh, go talk to my granny. She knows everything about this island. And sent us down, knocked at the door, and the granny, B. Freeman, invited us in for tea. And we chatted, and I fell in love with her place instantly. It was full of memories, her memories and things. And the secretary in the architecture firm I worked for, her mother lived on Pender, but I didn't know what her last name was. And I just happened to ask B, and she said, oh, that's Gertrude. That's my next door neighbor. And so she invited Gertrude down for tea. And we were thinking, as it was getting 4 or 5 o'clock, that we should try to get back and catch a ferry. And Gertrude said, oh, dearies, you have to spend the evening with me. So we did that. And at 7 a.m, B phoned up and said, I've decided I really like you, and I'd like to sell my house to you. I've been thinking of selling it, and there's been all kinds of problems within the family as to who's going to have it. And if I sold it to you, it would solve all kinds of family problems.
Win-win.
So she said, come down in an hour and we'll talk terms. And I came down, kind of chatted with her, and she said, I think it's worth about $15,000, and we could sign an agreement, and if you don't like it, you can tear it up. So I thought, okay, and signed this agreement, and then went back to Vancouver and thought, well, what have I done? And so I contacted a developer I knew, and he put me in touch with a realtor, actually in Nanaimo at the time, and the realtor said, well, based on what you're saying, the land should be worth $15,000 and the house should be worth $15,000. So you're getting one of them for free. So
wow.
We decided, okay, let's go for it. At the time, I didn't know. All I'd seen was the front door and the inside of the house. It was kind of foggy and rainy. I didn't know the ocean was right next to it. Didn't know any of those things. So it was, and then she had decided that she would leave some of just priceless pieces of furniture, and then but when we came over, the family had moved in and taken everything out of the house.
Oh, no.
So we spent the next 6 months just kind of gradually furnishing it, and over the years have built it into a really nice home. So, yeah.
Okay. And so what year was this in roughly?
This would have been 72.
72.
Yeah.
Okay. And you're still in the same house.
Still in the same house.
It's the house with the skylight that you were talking about. Wow. Okay.
And so it didn't have skylights then. But that's why I was telling you I've just been working on a story of 50 years on Pender, which will be at the end of this year. So,
yeah, totally. Well, actually, and just to let the audience know a little bit about that, is that you're writing about 20 stories that celebrate your experiences on Pender over the last 50 years.
Yeah.
That's great.
And a few of them I've been putting into, like I just did one on the hippie days on Galvin Point Road in South Pender that I've put onto a display panel for the South Pender Historical Society. So ghosts I have known and met on the island, and so little chapters that'll be kind of interesting, I think.
Right on. And your house is located just off of near Gallant Point?
Yeah.
So this is on the South Island for people who are listening, near the very end of the tip of the South Island. Gallant Point, Brooks Point, I tend to think is the most beautiful place on all of the islands, both north and south. But that's just my opinion. I love it down there. It's great. So that's a lovely place to live. And so after you purchased the house, how did that experience wind up going for you in the first couple of years?
Well, it was really interesting. So I was teaching at UBC in this experimental arts program, and I had a young family, 2 young girls. So I didn't have a lot of time to be here. So we'd come over about every second weekend, and then 4 months in the summer. And what started to happen was that friends started to ask if they could come over and use the place. So we started to rent the place out to friends who were writing their Ulyssean novel or completing their movie. And we would work out an arrangement with them that whenever we wanted to use the house, we'd come over and they would go back to Vancouver and stay in our place or in a place that they already had there. So we did that for a few years. And so we would kick them out in the summer and move over and then kind of go back. And after a couple of years of doing that, each time I went back into Vancouver, it was noisy, was smoggy. And I thought, I really don't want to live there. I really want to be on Pender. So I had an opportunity to do a job in Victoria, one day visioning what a neighborhood in Victoria, the James Bay neighborhood, could be. This was quite a lot of the work I was doing at the time, architecturally. And they turned around and said, Smarty Pants, can you make this vision work? And I developed a 5-year plan for them. And then they asked if I would enact that plan. And it was a pretty major thing. We had to, at that time, James Bay was zoned high-rise, like the west end of Vancouver.
Oh, really?
And all the old houses were being wiped out, torn down. Developers were coming in and bringing in undesirable tenants, and they would force the neighbors then to sell, and then they would buy it up, and they would just go down and basically block bust an area and then put up a high-rise. So we had to change the zoning and envision a neighborhood that was livable. And they turned around and said, okay, Smarty Pants, make this work. And I thought, okay, it's a lot easier to get the Pender from Victoria than Vancouver. So we moved over there. And for 16 years, I worked with this project. And quite often I could actually live on Pender. For periods of time, I would fly into Victoria once a week. I'd fly into Vancouver once a week. I would phone up the little float plane that would come into Bedwell. I'd phone them up at 8 o'clock. They said they could be there at 8:30. I'd walk down. I'd fly into Vancouver, and where I worked was 2 blocks away from their place. I could actually get to work in Vancouver quicker than when I lived in Vancouver and had to drive.
Wow, really?
So it was kind of a neat arrangement. So we started to spend more and more time here. But I still had kind of connections back to the cities where most of my work was. Yeah.
Okay, well, this is interesting about the idea of you spending this much time working with the community at James Bay and having a vision for what it could be and spending so many years doing that. I want to spend some time sort of delving into that. So what exactly was your vision that you had at the time, and how did it all unfold over those many, many years that you were working on it?
So originally, we met with all the kind of community leaders to vision what the community could be. And then they got a grant to hire me. And so for a year, one day a week, I would fly over to Victoria, to James Bay, and mainly around the community infrastructure. Out of that came 4 different major areas, one being education and recreation, one being health and social services, one being services for teens and seniors, and then all the community infrastructure parts that would fit in with those. And in that process, at the time, the NDP had come into power. They had raised a whole block of old heritage houses. Actually, I think it was done before the NDP came in. So the Socreds before that had wiped out a whole block for a parking lot for public service employees and around the legislative building. So we were really putting a lot of pressure on government. And the NDP, when they came in, had put out a pilot project to do 5 human resource centers. This is Dennis Koch and Norm Levy were working on this. And so these were to be integrated health and human resource centers. And they were to be in rural areas, but we were putting so much pressure on the government. They said, look, will you get off our backs if we give you one of these projects? And so we said, okay. So basically, they set up a whole government structure. There would be a resource board that would be elected and would run all the health, social services. At the time, we said we want education and recreation involved with that. They agreed initially, but then the education minister backed out, saying this was going to set a precedent for the whole province that I'm not going to be able to deal with. But we did get funding, major funding, and set up this community health and human resource center and board. At the time, a developer had, if you know James Bay, there was right in the center, there's a shopping mall and things, and he'd done an apartment. The main floor of the shopping mall was going to be leased to different groups, so we convinced them to give us a space in the mall, plus the whole first floor of what was supposed to be residences, and within 6 months they designed a health and human resource center that I had designed for them. They built it, and we moved in and basically set up a structure that provided all the services in the community. So this 15-member board, we hired doctors, nurses, developed home support programs, did recycling programs, allotment garden programs, community newspapers, teen center, senior center, got a grant to build. So initially we took over the school. We did an agreement with the school board that whenever the school wasn't being used for school purposes, it could be used for community purposes. And we ran 60 programs out of the school. Then got a big grant, LAP grant, to add on to the school with a community center. So it was kind of that type of work. I started out with 4 staff and ended up with 120.
Wow.
16 years later. So.
Wow. It's really interesting because, I think about so many experiences I've had in the James Bay area because I lived in Victoria briefly. And I think James Bay is beautiful, but from my perspective, you show up and all these things are around and no even questioning about how they are manifested or arrive in those situations. But it sounds like that there's a lot of creativity and thought that goes into making all these things happen.
And we were young and idealistic. And there's some really interesting things that happened. We got set up. The NDP got defeated kind of 9 months after we were set up. So-creds came in with a campaign to abolish us. and so I ended up getting Vanderpool down and trying to convince him. They didn't know how to deal with the fact that we had a whole medical center set up, and we're paying doctors on salary and stuff like that. And so they agreed to give us 1 year to evaluate us. They set up an evaluation team. The evaluation team said, this is a really good model. And so they did a report that was 100% positive, and the health minister just threw up his hands and said, okay, as long as you don't cause any problems for us, we'll let you exist. So a couple of years later, Grace McCarthy came into power, and she had a memory of wanting to abolish us, and I was vacationing in Greece at the time, and I got a telegram saying that Grace has decided to get rid of the program. Can you, the whole thing, can you come back and help it? And so I went in, and I had just finished reading a book called The Tai Chi of Management. And basically she had all the power, and the Tai Chi of Management kind of says, like, when you're attacked, you just let the force move into you, and then as it starts to lose its energy, you kind of counter move. And I thought, okay, I'll try that. So I ended up in a meeting with herself and Hugh Saville, who was her assistant, and I knew him quite well, and I knew he was fair but very, very exact. And so I just sat there and I said, what about severance for all the staff? Oh, we'll pay for that. What about, we've got rental agreements for the next 5 years. We'll cover that. What about seconded staff? We'll deal with all these things. So I ended up, after the meeting, she just said, you can deal with Hugh around all this. And I did a 50-page report saying this is what the cost will be for you to do all the things that you've said you'll do, which gave us 2 full years funding. And our act allowed us to take our resources, put them into reputable community organizations. So we took this Health and Human Resource Board that had 15 people kind of basically running the community, and made about 20 different nonprofit organizations and divested all our resources into them and kept on going. I told staff, you can either take severance or you can trust me and I'll try to get you work. I think I can promise to do that over the next couple of years. And in 2 years, we were running just as well as we had beforehand with all these separate little organizations.
Wow.
And Grace was furious at me. She was just furious. But there's nothing she could do. So
That's amazing. So you totally flipped the script on them.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Wow. So after all those years of doing the work in there, and what made you decide to leave that situation, and what is your lasting memory of that when you're thinking about this is what I feel like really most proud about, what would it be?
Well, I never set out to be an administrator. It wasn't really what my goal was. And I worked part-time, but they gave me all kinds of freedom. So I took on other jobs. I would still do architectural kind of work, helping design the community infrastructure for things like Tumbler Ridge as a new town in BC. One of the things that really excited me, because I was spending more and more time doing yoga, teaching yoga, was wellness and the whole concept of wellness, which was pretty new at the time. They had just set up the Health Promotion Directorate in the federal government. And I had a meeting with them, and we were doing health fairs. So we took over the elementary school and ran a health festival for the weekend and brought in all of the resources from all of Victoria. And we bring in people from the States, major speakers. We would have demonstrations. We would have workshops. We would have bookstores bringing in books on displays for wellness. We would have St. John's Ambulance. We had like hundreds and hundreds of different things happening. And we had 8,000 people that would come for the weekend. And it got to the point where it was so big, we took over the Oak Bay Rec Center after 2 years at James Bay because we just couldn't handle it. So one of the things that I talked to the health promotion director about was people were starting to phone me from all over the United States and Canada about this health festival I was putting on. And so I ended up getting a grant to write a book on putting on health festivals. And got to tour throughout the States, and probably the most interesting was going to the Festival of the Mind, Body, and Spirit in London for a week with 80,000 people turning up and interviewing people and writing a book, which I did with an editor that I'd hired on. And one of the recommendations we had out of that book was to do a magazine that would promote Canadian people in wellness. I had no intention of doing this, but the health promotion directorate turned around and said, okay, if this is going to happen, you're going to have to do it. So we set up what we called Wellspring, a quarterly magazine. It would be like the Harrowsmith of wellness. And for Western Canada, which is where the health promotion directorate said, you have to keep it to Western Canada because that's where our funding arrangement works. And we did about a 64-page magazine that came out quarterly that promoted wellness, all kinds of different things. So I was doing those kinds of things as well as running this center, and administratively running it was pretty easy until we had hiccups, like political hiccups and stuff like that. And I got to a point after 16 years where I'd done pretty much as I could. And it was at that point that I really decided there was other things I wanted to do in life. I wanted to follow some passions of theater, music, dance. So I retired, took off and traveled the world for a couple of years and moved to Pender.
Okay, fantastic. All right, well, let's jump into the next phase of your life after that. So You said you did some traveling. Where did you go and what did you experience?
Oh, well, I'd been doing traveling before that. I pretty much involved in the whole yogic world, and I was teaching yoga at the time, teaching in Victoria, coming over here and teaching, originally at the old school next to the library. And then when the new school got built in the little community room, and then more later into the community hall. And I did a lot of traveling around BC. I was designing health and human resource centers in Tumbler Ridge, some of the rural areas that had been chosen, and Haida Gwaii, Queen Charlotte at the time. I was spending quite a bit of time up there, and I was sitting on a little hill called Toe Hill up in Rose Spit, and I was struck by this lightning bolt, and I was told I was to go to Findhorn community in northern Scotland. I didn't know anything about it at the time, and got back to Victoria and found out that the leaders of the Findhorn community were in Victoria while I was up in the Charlottes talking about the community. So a number of the yoga people knew all about this. So I got kind of filled in a bit and talked to my partner at the time and said, I'd really like to go there. And she wanted to go to India to study yoga. So we made an agreement that we would do both, and took 4 months off and went to England, Scotland, and then to India for a period of time. And I loved India. I loved being in India. So we were in ashram for 4 months there.
Okay.
But I spent a month just traveling around with my backpack, a couple $2 a day, and just living with the people. And so I'd been doing that quite a bit. When I retired, I took off to visit a brother in New Zealand, stopped off in Fiji on the way. Probably the most interesting experience, I went to Vanuatu, because when I was working in James Bay, we had twinned with Vanuatu as a twinning, sending doctors there.
Okay, is that a community in Fiji?
Vanuatu?
Yeah.
It's a series of islands in the South Pacific.
Okay, all right.
And so I went there because one of the doctors was still there. It wasn't a doctor I knew well because it was after I'd left, but I wanted to kind of go and connect, and went, and it was his birthday, and we spent some time on this little island with There's 4 white people lived on it, and all the Vanuatu. And I had heard that one of the villages did a lot of dance and things, and so I asked if it would be possible to go visit the village. And one of the other white people said he'd been asked to go up by the chief, and so said, "Would you like to come with me?" And I said, "Yes, but I think I could stay there." He said, "I don't know. I don't know if any white people have ever stayed there before." So they sent a message out, and the chief said they'd accept me in custom, which meant bringing gifts.
Okay.
Chief was about 4 feet high,
Wow.
4.5 feet high, just twinkly eyes. I fell in love with him. And we sat around what's called the Nakamel, their spirit center, and drank Kava, which the young boys chewed the root of a pepper plant and mixed it with their saliva, poured it through a coconut bowl, or through a coconut leaf sieve into a coconut bowl, and then we would say goodnight to each other, take a drink, and sit around the fire in the Nakamel. And the kava was fairly hallucinogenic. So what I remember of it is that I had very clear kind of memory, but I had very little control of my muscular body. And at one point I got up and I walked around, and you kind of, traditionally you took a drink of the kava and you put a bunch in your cheeks and you spit it out to the gods as an offering. So I spent a number of days in this village. No one spoke any English whatsoever, but Vanuatu was a French-British protectorate, and they had originally sent one of their kids to a French school for 2 weeks, and then decided that they didn't want to do that anymore. So he spoke a few French words, and I spoke a few French words, and we gradually started to understand each other a little bit. So we sometimes got way off limits, and I would sing songs that I knew. They would sing songs that they knew. We had a pretty magical experience. From there, I went to Bali, had beautiful experiences there, through Indonesia, ended up in Singapore and Thailand. And by the time I got to Thailand, I was getting a little bit tired of traveling. And I met this young woman who had just come back from studying Thai massage in Chiang Mai. And I thought, well, that would be a really nice thing to do. I could just stay in one place for a while. So I ended up going up there. I got there a week before this course started, met this Buddhist monk, asked me if I'd ever ridden an elephant before. And I said, yes, because I had for 10 minutes in India. And he said, well, would you help me bring an elephant back from the Burmese border? And so for a week, I rode on the head of this elephant.
What, for a week?
Yeah.
Wow.
As we brought this elephant back.
Yeah.
It was pretty magical. And then I spent the next month studying Thai massage. And it was interesting when I got to Thailand. I was actually in Singapore. I'd run out of money. I only had $40 Canadian left. And I had a ticket to Thailand, to Bangkok. So I thought, I'll go to Bangkok. So I went to the bank to try to get money off my credit card. And my credit card had been put a stop on because I hadn't paid for a number of months. So I had to spend half of my money phoning someone back home to try to see if they could put money into my account to get my credit card reactivated. And so I had flown to Bangkok. And by that time I had $20 left. So I was living on about $1 or $2 a day. And one of the things that was kind of fun is that there was a royal procession down on one of the first days I was there for the Queen's birthday. And I was taking pictures, and the procession went into this big sports area, and they thought I was a press photographer. So they gave me a press photographer badge, which had food. And so each day I would go, and I only had a roll of film that had about 30 pictures. So each day I would take a couple of pictures of this event. And there was kind of entertainers from all over the South Pacific that came. So I did that and finally got enough money to go. My money came through after I had about $4 left. So then I went up to Chiang Mai and did the Thai massage and came back after that. So
Okay.
yeah, it was a pretty fun trip.
Yeah. And what year was this in roughly?
Oh, this would have been in late 80s, early 90s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was funny, actually, just when you're giving that story about taking the Thai massage, I was reflecting back. There's actually a picture on the wall right there, and it's Jennifer and I doing a reflexology course in Thailand.
Uh-huh.
And up in Chiang Mai as well, too. So, so I'm picking up what you're putting down about the part of that experience, but not riding an elephant for a week. That's incredible. So you mentioned the word dance as well too when you were talking about your experience in that village, and that became a bit of a part of your life. But I want to talk about that. But before I do, you said that you were teaching yoga, and so this was at a time before yoga became explosively popular. Yeah. What made you decide to become a teacher of yoga? And I guess you still do it today?
I do. I haven't been teaching since COVID, but up until then, I've been teaching on Pender. So my partner, when we had our first child, she wanted to do something just to get back in shape again after being pregnant. And she started taking a yoga class in Vancouver. And when I was teaching in the Arts 1 program, you could teach in that program for 2 years. So 5 instructors came from different backgrounds, and we each brought our perspective, kind of interest into a theme. So the first year we looked at the creative process and the difference between the way artists and scientists came to the creative process and how that worked. Second year we looked at reality and whether it was something that as an individual you created your own reality and brought to society, or whether society created a reality that imposed on you as an individual. And so as part of that course, once a week we would bring in someone to talk around the theme. And I thought, I'll bring in this yoga teacher just to talk about the reality of yoga. So it was a pretty interesting discussion. And then we had moved over to Victoria, and she phoned and said, I'm bringing this guru from India to Vancouver. Would you be interested in doing a weekend with him on Victoria? So we said yes, we would do that. And so he came, and we just had a group of 50 people in our backyard. And he was a Raja yogi who worked with stories and the intellect. And I would ask, I was still pretty skeptical of yoga in some ways. So I would ask him questions. Why would you want to follow a teacher rather than do your own thing? And he would say, well, he said, you come from Saskatchewan. The role of a teacher, think of it this way. You're walking through a snowdrift, and the role of the teacher is to take those first steps. So as you're walking through the snowdrift, if he's already put his footprints, it's easier for you to follow along. And so he would say, if this person is moving towards the light through the snowdrift, you have to be careful because you're always in his shadow, and you'll never see the light yourself.
Good reply.
I thought that's really interesting. So he said, at some point, you have to be really discerning to step aside from a teacher, or a teacher needs to be able to move aside so that you can follow your own path. So then I would ask him a question like, well, why would you want to follow a path of light rather than darkness? and he said, well, that's a really good question. He said, they both lead to the same place, but to follow a path of light is a little easier in this world than following a path of darkness to get to that place. And I would ask all these questions and he would answer them. And by the time we were finished this weekend, I realized that he had become my teacher. And so at that point in time, my partner was teaching, and she was going out every night teaching, and I was working all day and coming home and looking after the kids all night. And I, somewhat foolishly at the time, thought, why don't you teach at home, and then I could have some freedom. And so she decided to do that. But then what happened was that I had to be quiet at home. I couldn't actually really do very much. I couldn't go out in the workshop and work because it made too much noise. So I started taking her class. I thought, well, I might as well just be part of it. And then this woman had come back from India who had a problem with her back, and she'd had two vertebrae fused, and it had caused the next vertebrae to go out. And the medical establishment said, we can fuse that. And she said, no, I'm not going to. She went to India and worked with a guy called BKS Iyengar, and he put her through a pretty tough regime, but totally cured the back. So she came back and started doing monthly workshops. And she was in her 50s, and at that time I was in my 30s. And she had us in little pools in the corner. She was just so strong, and I really admired her. And so I started taking classes at the Y, and then the teacher, we were doing group work there, and the teacher looked at me one day and said, you should be teaching. And I thought, oh, this is going to cause some problems family-wise, because it was my partner's love. But she was adamant, and so I started teaching yoga, and then it just kind of grew from there.
And did you take the teacher training in Vancouver?
No, I took it in Victoria.
Yeah.
But at that time, there was no teacher training. There was apprenticing.
Okay.
Which is quite different than what it is now. So basically, I would just work with other teachers. And pretty soon it was at the Y in Victoria. And I was noticing that all the other teachers were female. They weren't being paid very much compared to male fitness instructors and things like that. So I kind of took that on for them, because then when they wanted me to teach, I said, well, I'm not going to teach for that amount of money.
Okay.
So then I just said, it's not fair what you're teaching. I mean, based on the money you're getting in from the yoga program, which was really popular at the time, you're just not paying your teachers much. So I started to advocate for the teachers, and then became in charge of bringing in once a month resource people from all around the world to do yoga workshops. And so I brought people in from Australia, Greece, India, all over. So it was a pretty fascinating time.
It's interesting, Robert, you talk about all these things that you wind up doing in your life. And so the question that came to me is, like, what inspired you to get people in from different parts of the world? Because most people wouldn't do that, right? All the steps that you're taking, most people would have stopped well before. What makes you decide, oh, I'm going to try to bring in some people from around the world and create a different experience for people? Where does that come from?
Well, it was the way we learned. And initially, we bring in people from, say, the States, where, it wasn't that far for them to travel from, say, San Francisco or something like that. And they'd come up. And then I started to travel a bit more. So I started going to Greece to study with a teacher I really liked. And then I would bring her back to Victoria and do workshops. And then we'd come over to Pender and do a weekend workshop here. So it was that type of thing that started to happen. One teacher that I absolutely loved, his mother had gone to see Iyengar in India to get pregnant, and a Dill was the result. And so he grew up in the ashram for quite a period of time, and then came over to Seattle. And so we brought him up, and then his brother came from India and did 108 poses as one dance, a continual movement of 108 poses. I mean, beautiful, beautiful stuff.
Sounds beautiful.
Yeah. So each of these teachers brought a different perspective. Was one teacher from San Francisco that was gay and had a whole different way of working with the male body. Angela Farmer from Greece had been studying with Iyengar and then was traveling around India and was looking at all these tantric friezes of these voluptuous women in poses and said, this isn't the way my body feels. Iyengar was part of the military, so he was much more militaristic in the way he taught. And so she started to develop her own technique of teaching more from a feminine perspective. And I loved that because I thought I was fairly macho, and I needed to kind of soften and fuel my feminine side. So,
And did you from that experience?
oh yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, it's wild. All these stories you're talking about, it seems like you're always connecting people. You're bridging people. You're creating a lot of situations where people are able to have experiences that they might not have. Like, do you see that within yourself as somebody who's a bit of a connector?
Yeah. I'll give you a really good example of how that worked. And when I went to Findhorn the first time, I got quite involved in the community. A pretty funny experience. So in the Findhorn community, they have a focalizer that in each area. So like the dining room or the kitchen or the garden. And you start off the day working in those areas, and the focalizer does a little meditation and calls the angel of the dining room or kitchen to guide you. And so I agreed to help work in the dining room at one point in time. So the first day, this focalizer was in a group holding hands, and the focalizer asked for the angel of the dining room to come and bless us. And I was really moved. And I went home that night and thought, well, I'd love to be able to invoke an angel to come. And I went back the next day, and the focalizer had to go out of the community to buy some things. People looked at me and said, you should be the focalizer today. And I just gulped and closed my eyes and said, okay, angel, if you're up there, help me. And pretty soon, words started coming out of my mouth. And I had no idea really what I was saying. But when I finished, people were in tears. And they said that was absolutely beautiful. So I became the focalizer for the next 2 weeks. And as part of that, they were looking at redesigning the community, part of the community. And I looked at the design. I didn't like it. And I was asking someone about it. And they said, well, we're having a meeting of the kind of key people in the community. You should come. And at first, when I came, they weren't sure that I should be there because I was a guest.
Okay.
But they finally said, okay, we'll let you be here. And at the end, the person who was focalizing it said, do you have anything you want to say? And I said, yes, I do. This is the way we deal with these kind of issues back home in my experience. And it just kind of resonated with them. So then I became part of envisioning the future of the Findhorn community. So it's kind of the same thing I was doing in James Bay all of a sudden started to happen at Findhorn. Second time I went back, I was in Greece, and I went back for a week, and I wanted to do something that was not in my head. And so there was a sacred dance workshop that happened, and I kind of took part of this sacred dance workshop. I met 3 women during this period. The first, it was summer solstice, and I was sitting down at the beach, and there was this woman that was down the beach, a quarter kilometer, and I didn't realize how long. I mean, we're up far north, so the sun didn't set till like 11:30 at night. Finally, after it set, I got up and I walked along the beach, and as I walked by her, she just stood up and took my hand, and we didn't say a word. She just walked with me, holding hands. Took me back, and I was about to say goodbye without saying a word, just squeezing her hand, and she just took my hand and led me into her place where she was staying, made love to me. And then the next day I thought, well, what has happened? At this point I was separated, so I went back to her and I started asking her questions, and she said, I can't be your teacher. I'll send someone. So the next day, this absolutely beautiful woman walks in, and I just said, well, I'd love to meet her. And she just walks up to me and said, hello, would you give me a massage tonight? And I give her a massage, and she says, this is what you need to know. The person that you've met is a white witch from Switzerland, and you've entered into a world of very strong female energy. You've entered into this world that very few men enter into, and you were just so open. She thought you were one of us, but realized, oh no. So the second person became a teacher and just let me know what was going on. This world I was entering into, we spent all night just chatting. I'd ask her questions, she'd answer them for me. Finished off the morning, just had a shower together, give each other a big hug. By that time, I was starting to feel a fair amount of I'd been exposed to a lot of female stuff. I just needed some time to think about it. The person who was running the Sacred Dance Workshop came up to me and said, I've met this woman. I think you would just absolutely love to meet her. The two of you would get on. And I just said, well, I think I've had my fill of women. And he said, no, I'm going to bring her for lunch. And so at lunch, he walked in with her, and I just, even before she sat down, I just looked at her and said, oh, we have this connection then. And she just said, what do you know about the Earth Mother? And I said, I've written this poem for you. And I would say, what do you know about this? And we spent the next 24 hours just sharing again information. All three of these women had fallen in love with this teacher of sacred dance who wasn't there at the time, but they said, you need to meet him. And I mean, this is the kind of stuff that was happening at the time. It was kind of crazy in some ways. My brother, I knew, was going to be in London, but I had no idea where he was going to be or anything. And I would just put out into the universe that I was flying down on this plane and meet me at the airport, and he'd be there.
What?
This is the kind of stuff that was happening. And the kind of thing that happened at Findhorn is that people were doing all kinds of stuff like this. The feeling was that it was a place in the universe where the ley lines connected with the universe, and that you could move between the upper and lower worlds really easily. So I got back to London, and I had really formed a strong connection with this architect in Greece when I was there doing yoga, and this other young woman who, when I was there, I had a song that came into my head, and she had kind of helped me bring it into reality. And I sang it with a woman named Julie Felix, who would be like the Joan Baez of the European folk music at the time.
Okay.
And so she was in London, and this architect and April were both at Julie's house. So I went over there, told them what had happened to me, that these women had asked that I meet this person. And I said, I don't have time to go there, but April, I think you should. And I gave her $100 and said, you go and be my proxy. So she went there and just said, my whole world has opened up for me, and I'm bringing Colin back to Victoria to do a sacred dance workshop. So he came over, and we had 100 people do this weekend dance workshop. And at the end, people wanted it to continue. And he said, well, if it's going to continue, you're going to have to become the teacher. So he gave me a lot of his music, a lot of his notes, and just said, keep it going. And so I became a teacher of sacred dance.
And so in Victoria, was that your first meeting with this teacher, Colin?
Yeah, first time I'd met him.
Okay.
And that continued for a number of years. We did all kinds of rituals, summer, winter solstices, equinox, Beltanes, all these rituals and dances, and put out a newsletter that connected, again, people from all over kind of North America as to what was going on around sacred dance, and Europe, actually, in England. So when you ask, did I connect people? That's kind of how things worked.
Yeah, well, yeah, totally. That's I'm sure there's so much more to those stories that you told me about meeting certain people in Greece and being connected with the community in Scotland and all of that. But you mentioned sacred dance, and so for myself and people listening, what can you tell us about sacred dance? Because I have a vague understanding of that.
So it was something that a guy in Europe introduced, and it was kind of taking dance and creating a sacred space with it. So it could be as simple as taking a folk dance, but trying to understand what the essence of the dance was. So we would dance that would sometimes almost be in trance. Sometimes it would be very lively. We would take a piece like Pachelbel's Canon and create a dance to it. We would take a folk dance and dance it and try to really get into what it was as a dance. So it's hard to explain it in that kind of way. But what we started to do a lot was ritual around dance. So we might have a winter solstice and we would have readings that would be related to the winter solstice and dances that would be related or help bring that energy up. And so it was kind of connecting into, again, a lot of the female energies, a lot of the old pagan energies that existed before the kind of Catholic and Protestant churches put a lot of that underground in Europe. And so, I mean, if you go back into Morgan Le Fay and all these kinds of peoples, a lot of that pagan energy was there. And actually, interestingly enough, a lot when I was at Fintorn and working with the ley lines, a lot of the churches were built on those energy lines that crisscross.
Yeah, of course. I'm familiar with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Potent places in the world.
Exactly.
It's not just a random place where they put those things.
Yeah.
For sure. But when you speak about creating a dance, are the dances choreographed?
Yes.
And so how long would it take to be able to memorize a dance? Would there be like weeks of preparation for this, or?
Well, quite a few dances we made up ourselves. After a period of time, I had two other women that taught with me. And so we would take turns. So we didn't have to do it all the time.
Yeah.
But we would work together to create an event. So when we would get together, it would be like for 2 hours. And we would start out with certain kind of dances. We would do readings, and we would then progress to a place where it brought it all together. Colin, who was the person who got me interested in it, had put out a couple of books of dances and what their meanings were. So it could be things like King of the Fairies as a dance, and which is got music to it and things, and we would dance that. So he would choreograph it. People around the world would choreograph different dances, and then we would publish them so that other people could follow it.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we just made up our own dances right on the spot and teach them. So it was a pretty easy kind of way of going. When I was putting out the newsletter, I would take things like Robert Bly or different people's readings and kind of put them together, put out where different events were happening throughout Canada, United States, and England. So you could go to the Festival of the Mind, Body, Spirit in London and kind of June 28th, July 1st, or things like that. So.
Again, connecting more people. I'm thinking two things I wanted to ask. The first one was, did you develop a sense of community through this?
Yes.
Of course, right?
A huge sense of community. And it still exists, interestingly enough.
For sure. And the second thing is that I have some experiences with things along those lines, but not many in my life, but I have. And I think it's very difficult to put into words, but I'm going to ask you to try. For esoteric experiences like that, what is it that you feel once that experience is over? So the thing is that if you are going to engage in that world and become a teacher of that dance and organize and say there's the winter solstice coming and we're going to do a dance together, what is it that you're looking forward to experiencing once that is over, if you're able to put something like that into words?
It's not over. So it continues through. Even though you're not doing it, it's still there with you. I'm just trying to think how to answer that. For example, when I started doing the dance, it brought together a number of men that decided we wanted to form a men's group. So once a week we met as a group of men, and that would then we would decide, okay, let's do a kayaking workshop. And then we would end up going kayaking, and we would invite a lot of the women from the dance and go out to the Broken Islands or something like that for a week. And that's continued. Now that group of guys has met with other guys, and we've been kayaking now for over 35 years together. So those connections don't dissipate, they last. And the event might be over, but I would be going out for dinner with some of the people involved, or we would be, and a good example of what happened was that I did sacred dance. I met a guy that I became quite close to who ended up teaching folk dance at the university. So he said, would you like to teach it with me? So we did a mixture of sacred dance and folk dance. And then from that, we ended up in meeting another guy who did kind of Latin dancing, and we would do salsa and tango. and then we would go off to Seattle for kind of a whole weekend of dancing, and end up doing contra dancing and square dancing. And so it would just explode all over the place. So we would get together in smaller groups. We would socialize together, but in the energy that would be created would be living in us. So I say it doesn't go. It was just become part of who we were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure it does. And when I start out by asking and saying it's difficult to put into words, thank you. I think that was a good explanation. And just to even go further with that, because I find it really fascinating, is that, we're all searching for a sense of meaning in our lives. And at certain points in our lives, or maybe most of it for some people, it's difficult to really locate where that meaning is sometimes, right? But with the sacred dance, I'm getting the impression that you found like a very deep sense of meaning that came to you. Was this a surprise, or were you always kind of somebody who was very tuned in with their body and with movement, or was this just something that sort of came out of the blue at a certain age for you?
Well, it came out of the blue a bit. It manifested itself. One of my daughters, as she grew up, did ballet. And then as she got into her teens, started working with Linda Reno, the dance company, doing contemporary dance. And I went to one of her performances, and I couldn't stay in my seat. I want to do this. So I asked her, and I said, do you think it would be all right if I took dance classes? Not with her, but this. And she said, oh, sure. So I started doing contemporary dance, which I loved. But as I moved to Pender, it was really hard because it was twice a week, and I couldn't always get in. And if I missed a week, it was really hard to pick it up. So I moved from there into improv dance, which didn't have a set sequence that I had to know each time. And it was kind of the beginning of my real interest in dance. So at the time, and I was around just under 50 at the time, and so I decided I really wanted to get more into dance, into music, into theater, into my artistic part. And it was fun. I mean, we would, at one point in time, there was an improv theater performance at McPherson. So 3 of us as improv dancers were asked if we would be the transition between each improv theater piece. So we would get up on stage, and the audience would throw a word to us, and we would dance it.
Fun.
For about 5 minutes until the next group was ready to come on. And the audience, after a couple of times, I thought, okay, let's see if we can get really obtuse words that are going to be really hard for them to dance.
Of course they did.
But there's things like that was really kind of fun to do. And then, I mean, I got involved in music because some of the people that were doing dance, we went down to a dance thing in Seattle, and there was this band, Zimbabwean music band that was playing, and we just fell in love with it. And we had a teacher come up at UVic, and we took marimba lessons, and out of that, we ended up forming a band and going off to Zimbabwe to study.
What? Going to Zimbabwe to study now?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, Robert. Jeez, all these life experiences. This is crazy. Okay, so go on. So
and
Zimbabwe.
It was really interesting because at that time my daughter's boyfriend was a reggae band promoter, and he had a reggae band, and then he brought in a band from Seattle that did marimba, and on condition that we would open for them. And we had only learnt 4 songs at that point in time.
It's good enough for an opening act.
Yeah, so we were at Herman's, and we go to start playing our first song, and we kind of short-circuited the power for the whole building, so we end up in darkness. Can't see our instruments. We were having to try to play along, and it was a gas. But we got to a point where we would go on tour all summer and play music festivals all the way from Haida to world music festivals in Winnipeg. And
wow. And so, I'm sorry, what instrument were you playing?
So we were playing African marimbas.
Okay. I'm actually unfamiliar with that word.
So it's like a wood xylophone.
A wood xylophone. Okay.
Yeah. All right. There's soprano, 2 sopranos, 2 altos, a tenor, and a bass. The bass is made out of 2x6 cedar keys.
Okay.
And we play it with lacrosse balls up on a big bench, and it's about 6 or 7 feet long and about 2 to 3 feet wide.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's great fun.
This is just blowing my mind, actually. And so, did you have any background in music before this at all? Or?
I had played recorder when I was in Vancouver. We formed a recorder quartet and played at things like Dollarton Mud Flat. We dress up in medieval costumes and play medieval music. But that was a very different type of music than playing Zimbabwean music. And I mean, we just loved the music, and so learned it and brought teachers in. And then we were busking on the causeway in Victoria and earning quite a lot of money because the noise was quite loud, and so it re-attracted a lot of people.
Yeah.
And we were earning this money and thought, what do we do with it? And I just kind of nonsensically said, well, we should go to Zimbabwe and study. And people just looked at me, and then we thought about it and said, yeah, that's a good idea. So we went there and had an incredible time, and then brought a lot of Zimbabwean musicians back to Canada, a lot of whom have stayed. And so we've been kind of working and we played up until COVID. I mean, we're getting to the point where we were going to retire anyways, because we were stretched all the way from Hornby to Victoria to Pender. We were all over the place living, and it was hard to get together to practice. At one point in time, we decided to get together once a month and practice, and we would be going over the same stuff. So we decided we would not do anything that we knew, and we would just improv. So someone would just start playing a piece, and then someone else would add to it. And we got to a point where we started doing that performance-wise. And there was one time in Duncan where we did this whole second half of a set where we just played one piece for an hour. And at the end, everyone was entranced, lying on the floor. We would just stop one by one and just join them. And
yeah, usually in a concert, people lying on the floor is not a sign of people enjoying it very much. But, but in that case, it totally is.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I'm so blown away here, Robert. Like, it sounds like there's like all these experiences that you just wind up saying yes to and following, and all these like magical experiences seem to take place in your life. Would you agree?
Yeah. I mean, I think the world's a magical place. So I mean, it's been interesting. I've never followed a very traditional path, and I've kind of let whatever happens that interest me grow and just see where it leads and things. So it's been pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, this is really inspiring hearing these stories because, not everybody does that. Like, I don't do that. I feel like I say no to a lot of things, or I'm too shy to do something. But a lot of things that you're mentioning sound pretty wonderful. Yeah. Speaking of saying yes to things, saying yes to purchasing a house so many years ago and then moving to Pender. Let's talk about a little bit of Pender stuff going on here.
Yeah.
So one of the things I want to touch on as well too is that your relationship with the Pender Island Health Centre and your involvement with that, because that's a really pivotal piece of our community. And I know you've been involved with that for a number of years, but maybe if you could let people know how you got involved and the work that you did while you were there.
Mm-hmm. So after I left James Bay and went traveling, I came back to Pender. James Bay gave me a really nice parting money so I could live on it for a few years. But I realized I couldn't live on it forever. And I didn't really want to work. I wanted to follow my music, my other interests. I was doing a lot of gardening at home. And the health center, I didn't really know at all. I hadn't used. The board of directors at the time, which were all volunteers, there was no paid administrative staff, went into James Bay because they'd heard that it was a model. So they went in and talked to people there, and the people there said, well, you should talk to Robert. He actually lives on Pender Island. So they got in touch with me and asked if I would come in for a day and help them. And so I said yes. And they were in trouble. It was just getting too big for a volunteer board to look after. They had added on what used to be the home support wing and moved people around, and some of the practitioners had twice as much space as they did before that, but weren't paying any different amount of rent, and the rents weren't picking up the costs of running the place. So it was a problem. So they turned around and got a grant to hire someone. I said, you really need to get someone in to help organize this. And then put pressure on me to apply. And I said, okay, I'll do it for a couple of years just to help out. So they had this initial grant, but they didn't really have any money to pay for an administrator. So the first thing I tried to do when I went there was to look at how much it costs to run the place and to take the square footage of the whole building and charge everyone an equal amount based on the square footage they were using that would cover the cost of running the place, which meant for some of the practitioners doubling their rents. I almost got run off the island. At the time, they were furious, but it was very logically laid out and it made sense, and they finally all agreed. So that was the first big thing I did. And that took the first year just to get all that organized and get the health center on good financial footings. And then the next thing I did, which was just my own pet project, was to try to look at it as a one-stop center for all your healthcare needs and bring in all kinds of wellness practitioners. And so the kinds of things I did at the time, there was a counselor that came over from Salt Spring, and I knew his boss because he had worked with me in James Bay, and just said, look, he ends up spending half his time on the ferry. If you just give us the money, we can hire someone directly, and we can double the amount of resource that we have all of a sudden. So they did that. I looked at the nursing staff. At the time, nurses were all coming over from Victoria. And so you'd get one nurse coming for one afternoon a month and another nurse coming for once every 2 weeks. And none of it was useful. So I went back and said, look, the government put out 20 special projects across BC for innovative work to integrate services. So I applied for one and put in a proposal for how we would take all these different nurses and hire one full-time nurse. And we were successful. So we got that. The lab services were being provided by San Pen. And again, someone would come over on the 9 o'clock ferry, would work for 2 hours and catch the 11 o'clock ferry back. So they spent 6 hours or more providing 2 hours of service. And I just said, it's costing you this amount of money to provide the service. You just give us that amount of money and we'll provide 3 times the service. And they agreed to do that. And so I built all these kind of programs. And then I would just talk to people I knew in the community, Shelley East Hope, and get her in to do shiatsu, massage therapy. At one point in time, there was a massage therapist on the island and she left, and I convinced someone from Victoria that they come over and said, you can actually stay in my place to make it economical and overnight. And so I, all kinds of stuff like this, and brought all these practitioners in. And so that was the second big thing until we really had a pretty good functioning process. And then when all that was in place, the building was starting to not be able to handle everything. I had 2 or 3 practitioners working out of one space. So someone would work for, like Mark as a chiropractor would work, say, 2 or 3 days a week, but he was renting the space full time. So I just said, look, can we put in a massage therapist in for the other 2 days? And Shelley was renting a space. And so we just started to really fill the spaces up. So then the next big thing in 2006, 2008 was adding on to the building. So I did up a design for it.
Because among other things, you're an architect as well, too. How about that?
So a lot of the work was just maintaining the facility and stuff. And I could do a lot of it myself, or I knew exactly, I could hire someone to do exactly what needed to be done and stuff like that. So it was pretty efficient. So with the new building, we needed to raise a lot of money in the community. And so I did the design. We undertook a fundraising drive to try to raise $100,000 in 100 days. Raised about $125,000
in 100 days.
Yeah, did all kinds of things. And then I went back to the Capital Regional District and said, we've raised this amount of money in the community. We had a fairly good budget set aside. I have to go back a bit. When the Home Support Agency was there, they were actually making money. And Robin Peterson, who was the director at the time, she kind of became my assistant. And so we kind of would work together. When the government decided to centralize all the home support services, moved it over to Salt Spring, they wanted to take the money with them. And I said, no way. If we had been losing money, we would have had to pay it. You wouldn't have paid for it. So because we're saving money, we're going to keep it. So we had a couple $100,000 set aside as a contingency for expansion. So I went back to the CRD and said, based on our population, the amount of money we've already raised in the community is enough to build a brand new hospital in Victoria if people put in the same amount of money per population. And they were just floored and said, okay, we'll come up with the rest of the money.
Wow.
And at the time, it was going to be about $1.2 million. We did up the drawings. We got an agreement from the building inspector that a structural engineer could sign off on them. And everything was agreed to. And then the building inspector had a building collapse on Saturna that was on posts in a big rain.
Uh-oh.
And he changed his mind. He said, no, you're going to have to get an architect's seal on it. You're going to have a mechanical engineer. You're going to have geotech engineer. You're going to have electrical engineer, all sign off on it. It ended up adding an extra $300,000 or $400,000 to the cost. And I had to find an architect then who would take plans and stamp them basically without changing them very much. And we found someone in Vancouver who agreed to do that, got all these engineers in, and then went back to the CRD and said, you've caused this problem. You need to come up with the extra money. And they agreed to co-share it with Island Health, who originally said they wouldn't put any money in. So we ended up with $1.5 million. And it was kind of fun. So what we agreed to do, I ended up getting a company in Duncan that would prefab all of the building materials, just the materials themselves, but not put it together, and bring it over in 2 trucks. So it was all cut to size and everything. And then just got a local contractor to put it together, and it worked really efficiently. And originally, Bob Funk was going to become the project supervisor, but because of the delay with the building inspector, he was doing 3 other jobs, and he just said, you should get Robert to do it. So I became the contract overseer.
Okay.
And it worked out really well because I knew where everything should go. And we had one situation with a roofer that contracted it out to someone who'd never done a metal roof before, did skylights improperly, did flashing improperly. And I said, we're not paying you. Took photographs of it and held back his amount of money. And he threatened to take us to court. And we said, you can do it if you want, but I've shown the building inspector what's happened. I've got all these photographs. You don't have a case, and what we're going to do is we're going to do all the improvements, and we'll deduct that from your costs. So I could do those kinds of things just because I knew what was going on, and so it worked out really well. And the nice part is that then we had to figure out, okay, how do we build on and move people in without closing everything down. So we built it around the courtyard, and I said I'll actually build the courtyard, and I'll do all the fencing and the putting the bricks down and the pools and things like that. And there were only then 2 doors that entered from the old part of the building into the new building, and we just got the new building all finished, tore these 2 doors down one weekend, and moved everyone into the new building because we had to do renovation on the old part too. So yeah, it worked out really well.
Wow, this seems like a ton of work. Something I was thinking when you were talking about finding a company in Duncan is like, that's not the first phone call you're making, right? For a situation like that, right? That it seems like that you've spent a lot of time in your life problem solving and trying to figure out the best way to do things.
Yeah,
but it's interesting when someone tells a story like you're telling now. It just like seems like, oh, this 1,000-piece puzzle just came together perfectly one after another. But no, I guess there's a lot of frustration and things that don't work out properly, and having to like back up and try again and everything. But this whole project with the healthcare center, was it something that actually did go somewhat smoothly, or were there like a lot of log jams along the way?
No, it went very, very smoothly.
Okay.
We had no hiccups at all. We had little things like as we were going to renovate the old part, I had to have an asbestos survey done, and they found asbestos in the flooring in the bathrooms.
Okay.
But they said as long as you don't touch the flooring, it's fine. So we'd have little things like that. So we would say, okay, we're just going to leave the flooring down because it's not a health issue until the flooring gets taken up. And at that point, then someone has to be careful with it.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, no, it went very smoothly. It went right in time. We were right on budget. So other than say that roof incident or with the building inspector in the first place was really set us back a few months in terms of time and stuff like that. Yeah, it went good.
And how long was your relationship with the healthcare center?
26 years.
26 years. And as my understanding that you're not currently involved, you've stepped down from that?
I retired just before COVID, actually.
Good on you.
Best decisions I made.
Yeah, really? Okay. Well, and like looking back at with all the time that you spent there, because like after you went through this process of, it seems like you were able to like maximize what was going on in the spaces and do the renovations. After all those were done, what was your role with the healthcare center those years following?
Mainly just administering the place, dealing with issues that would come up. There would be building issues. that would arise. There'd be kinds of things, say, with the ambulance building where it needed upgrading, or for periods of time, there would be 2 ambulance attendants, but they only had pull-out couches in one space, and you would have a male or female that didn't know each other that would be sleeping right next to each other, and we would say bring in the trailer so that you could have 2 sleeping places separate. So we do things like that. The pump in the well would go, so or staff would leave, and then I'd have to find someone else, and just running everything on budget. I don't think there's any year that we didn't run a bit of a surplus during that whole time. So,
You're totally retired? There's no work going on right now for you?
There's no paid work going on of any significance. I got involved in community work, I guess is probably a different. So, and I had been involved in that before. So I got involved with the Friends of Brooks Point at one point in time back in the 90s. A friend and I were sitting in his boathouse and just talking about, well, what do we leave our children? What do we want to leave our children on this island? And Brooks Point was one of the things. It was owned by a family I was quite close to, and they were pretty conservation minded. And so we worked out an arrangement with them. It was originally 3 lots, so it could have been 3 houses built on it.
Okay.
And so we formed a group called the Friends of Brooks Point. Again, did fundraising, and we had it evaluated at $750,000. The owner, Alan Brooks, said he would donate one of the lots if we could come up with the $500,000 for the other 2, and we spent 3 years raising monies to do that, doing everything you could possibly imagine.
Holy smokes. So $500,000 for 2 lots. What would that be worth today?
Be worth a fortune today. Yeah.
I can't believe. Wait, what year was this in?
This was in mid-90s.
Mid-90s. Okay, this makes sense.
Yeah.
Wow.
So we finally got the monies through, and a couple of big grants from conservancy groups and things like that to make it to a park. And then we worked out a management agreement with the CRD to operate it as a conservancy park, which is the only one they actually have in the whole region. And then 2 pieces of property have been purchased since that time to create the whole park.
And it's an amazing place. It is absolutely an amazing place.
So I spent, and I'm still involved with it. We're still trying to work out things with the CRD. In fact, I'm going to meet this afternoon around that. They want to put up a split rail fence on parts of it to keep people from trampling on it. And we think it's a bit of an overkill. And so the relationship, the CRD would love to just be able to do what they want with it without listening to the community. And we're trying to hold them to the fact that it's really the community that's part of the management plan and needs to be consulted in all of this. So I did that for a period of time, and then after that, the next piece was Greenburn Lake, and putting quite a bit of pressure on when the federal government looked at creating national park to save Greenburn Lake. Originally, I was going to buy it with one of the doctors when I first moved to the island.
Oh, wow.
But he and his partner split up partway through our negotiating process, so it never happened. And the national parks it wasn't on their priority list. They were trying to get Moresby Island. But the owner wouldn't sell for a price they could afford, and so they ended up getting Greenburn Lake. So those were the 2 major parts we really wanted to protect on South Pender. And then the next thing was the little church. And at one point in time, the neighboring property did a subdivision proposal. And as part of that proposal, they said that they would fund the renovation of the church. And we thought that was a good deal. But the Anglican diocese wanted too much money for it, even though it was the community that provided the land and did all the work initially.
Wow.
And so that broke down, but we had formed a South Pender Historical Society with a mandate to try to help preserve the church and things as part of this process. And when it broke down, we just decided to carry on, met with the parish. The diocese originally was thinking of getting rid of the church because it wasn't being used for church purposes anymore. The diocese kind of wanted to keep it. And so we've worked out an arrangement with them that the Historical Society does a lot of the maintenance and runs all kinds of programs. And we've been doing things all the way from grower and makers market, art off the fence, community music events, history talks on old settlers and things, and a lot of work with First Nations to try to reconnect them back. So that's taken a lot of my time and stuff. That's it's my community service.
Yeah, totally. And all these things are in your neighborhood, right? Because
Yeah.
the church that you mentioned is just the church up the hill from Poets Cove. So people have an idea of where that's located. But like Gallant Point and Greenburn Lake and the church, they're all in your neighborhood where you live.
All in my neighborhood.
Yeah.
And they're places that I use all the time. I mean, this summer I've been going up to Greenburn Lake, and I ended up swimming around the lake one day and absolutely loved it. And thought, oh, this is a really nice thing to do. So up until middle of October, I was going up there twice a week, and it takes about 40 minutes to swim around the lake.
Yeah.
And there's no one up there. It's like my own little oasis.
Yeah, I know. Over the summer, like multiple summers, my wife and I have gone up there and maybe 4:00 in the afternoon or so, and just had the place to ourselves. And it is a beautiful, magical place, Greenburn Lake. Yeah. And people don't go in the water. There's too many lily pads. It's too hard to get in. So it's like, okay. And it's great to have that place to yourself. Yeah, I'm sure there's so much more to talk about, but we're gonna wind this down now. But Robert, thank you so much for sharing all these stories. Sincerely, this has been really amazing to listen to, and actually very inspiring for me. All the things that you've done in your life that you mentioned today. I'm seeing that there's a lot of time and room available to do more. Because it sounds like you've done a lot with your life. It's incredible. But is there anything else that you want to say before we end this off?
The only thing I haven't mentioned is that I've really spent a lot of time over the last years in my garden and love it. And I partly started out because I thought, at some point, I'm not sure we can be totally reliant on the rest of the world for our survival. And it's a good opportunity to try to create a garden that would provide. And it does pretty much now. I mean, the fruit trees, the vegetables, the berries, different things, we can almost live on it year round, which is a pretty special thing. And so it's connected then into all kinds of things with the kind of vegetable collections and things like that at the fall fair and stuff. But that's a whole other story. So
yeah, but a love for growing your own food and being in the garden. And there's something really lovely about having your hands in the dirt and being close to the ground. And as we talked about before we started the interview, the enjoyment of harvesting, which I seem to have a problem doing. That last step in the whole process of harvesting, but that's the best part, it feels like.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again for doing this. Thank you, Robert.
Well, thank you.
Well, wasn't that just great? Thank you again to Robert for doing that interview with me. And thank you for sticking around and listening to the whole episode. I really appreciate that people enjoy these and listen to them. And if you did get a lot of enjoyment with this and you want to share it with people, please feel free to do so on social media. Up until this point, I haven't really done any sort of work with promoting the podcast and putting it out there. I just kind of have this philosophy of people will find it if they're meant to find it. But I would really like more people to hear these interviews. I think that they hold a lot of value and they're really important. And they really give us a deeper insight into people who live in and around our community. So sharing this with people in your friend groups provides this podcast an opportunity to be heard by people who might not hear it otherwise. As well, if you're curious about people's lives, if there's one thing I've found, that people do really enjoy answering questions about themselves. And I think we have such an opportunity to build stronger communities and stronger connections within our friendship groups when we show curiosity about people's lives. And again, if you'd like to support this podcast by purchasing a calendar made by my wife, you can do that by clicking on the link in the description at Geneva Jacobs Art. And lastly, thank you to Ben McConkey for providing the theme music for the show. And thank you. Until next time.